So, and then what you have is a time constant, and that's the parameter which describes the rate at which VO2 rises towards the steady state. How quickly does it achieve that? And I'm sure you can probably start to guess that this must relate to the degree to which somebody is aerobically fit. If somebody is aerobically fit, they will have a different response to somebody who is perhaps more anaerobically or power orientated, and we'll kind of talk about that in a moment as we look at a schematic. So if you have faster VO2 kinetics, that is, you get to the steady state quicker, you're going to spare the finite anaerobic capacity. In other words, if you've got faster VO2 kinetics, you will get to steady state quicker. If you get to steady state quicker, it means you're borrowing less of energy from these non-oxidative sources. You're having to borrow less phosphocreatine, you're borrowing less glycolysis. The net result is that you get less accumulation of hydrogen ions and ADP and even ammonia. And so what it does over here, by reducing the fall in muscle PCR and the utilization of muscle glycogen reserves, and limits the accumulation of metabolites that have been associated with fatigue processes. In other words, as I just said, hydrogen ion, ADP and phosphate. So if I have got fast VO2 kinetics, I absolutely get to steady state quicker. So therefore, if I'm more aerobically fit, my VO2 kinetics will be faster, I will hit steady state quicker, I will have a smaller O2 deficit. Now you can think about that athletically in a sporting situation. Why is that beneficial? Well, the sooner I've got an endurance athlete at steady state, the less anaerobic energy they're borrowing, and therefore the less fatigue they are developing. And remember, one of the issues that you face is once you've started to develop fatigue, the only way in which you can remove that or reduce that fatigue is by reducing the exercise intensity, which is not really conducive to what we want to do in sporting situations. But if you also think about this clinically, if you've got somebody who's got slow VO2 kinetics, then it really reflects that you've got somebody who's got poor cardiorespiratory fitness, and they may be struggling to reach a steady state, even going for a walk, for example. So if you've got somebody who's got impaired cardiovascular function, or even impaired respiratory function, or even some metabolic disorder in the muscle, their VO2 kinetics will be very, very slow. They're having to borrow large amounts of anaerobic energy, exercise becomes highly fatiguing, and so it's a real indication then of somebody's underlying cardiorespiratory fitness without even having to take somebody to VO2 max. So how do we know about this PCR concentration, this PCR response? Well, this I think is one of the most elegant studies I've seen in the field of exercise science. So this is some work from Harry Rossiter's lab. Harry's based now out at UCLA. And what they did was they had a group of participants and they recorded, as we've seen previously, the VO2 response to a period of constant load exercise. And here we've got the point where exercise is triggered, and therefore you would get the increase in the ATP demand. What they had them do, though, which was so unique, was they had them exercising, or they had their leg inside a scanner. And it's like an MRI scanner. And the foot is sticking out of the scanner, and the foot is attached to a pulley system that's got weights on it. And they were fundamentally asked to do plantar flexion extension with a weight attached to the foot in time to a metronome. So they've got an applied load at the foot, so therefore an increase in ATP demand, which will be reflected in the VO2 response at the onset of exercise. But the beauty with these scanners is they can be modified to track, based upon the resonance of any metabolite, the response to that metabolite. So in this case, they set it to the resonance for PCR. So what they are tracking now is the PCR degradation rate. So this is PCR at percentage. So this is, they start the muscle at rest with 100% PCR in the muscle, and then they track it in real time. So what you'll notice is, as soon as exercise starts here, the PCR concentration falls very, very rapidly. But notice that these are two pretty much mirror images of each other. In other words, this deficit area here is pretty much a reflection, not spot on, of the PCR degradation that you see here. So this is a beautiful way of demonstrating to us the use of the creatine kinase reaction at the onset of exercise. Now the reason they are not a perfect mirror, I mean they're pretty close, not perfect, was one, ATP will be used instantaneously on its own before we resynthesize it, and two, we're obviously going to be supplementing the PCR, which you can see there is a degradation. We've got about a 15% degradation here with some energy coming from anaerobic glycolysis as well. But it's a beautiful way of demonstrating to us the use of phosphocreatine at the onset of exercise and how that is reflected in relation to the deficit, and then as the VO2 levels start to match the demand of the tissue, the rate of degradation in the PCR slows down. And this is a stylized version that we took from our data from the lab, just to again represent this. So here's our VO2 response in the lab. So I've taken out kind of the phase 1, phase 2. This is fundamentally at rest, and then this is exercise. And this is just a model just to represent the same thing. So as we've already said, the higher the exercise intensity, the greater the ATP turnover rate, higher VO2 response, and therefore a greater PCR decline. So whereas in the previous schematic from Rossiter's group, they were looking at about a 15% decline, that might be for relatively low intensity exercise. If we were to go for much higher intensity exercise, you might be looking at a 50% decline within the first 3 to 4 minutes of exercise. So you end up with this quite nice mirroring, and that's why we are able to use the VO2 response as a proxy indicator of creatine kinase reaction in the muscle tissue. Now, this is it slightly zoomed in. So we've just fundamentally just focusing on the PCR concentration now. Again, here's our unloaded cycling. Here's phase 1. Here's phase 2. And notice the greatest decline in degradation is across phase 2. Because remember, by the time we get into phase 3, we should be at that point of steady state. We should be at the point really where the VO2 at the mouth that's been taken in is matching the QO2 at the muscle, because it's matching the ATP demand and the ATP turnover rate in the tissue itself. Now, this is quite a nice schematic and representation, which is useful to help us, because this is what happens if you alter the speed of the VO2 kinetics. So this is really a reflection of what we were talking about in terms of comparing, for example, a clinical patient to an athletic patient group. So here we might have somebody who's got very, very fast VO2 kinetics. So the net result is you get a very, very fast rise in the VO2 response. We hit steady state. If I've got much slower VO2 kinetics, so this is kind of a tau, so tau isn't that it takes 10 seconds to reach steady state, it's the 63% of the rise in the curve is achieved in 10 seconds, whereas 63% of the rise in the curve in this group was achieved at 90 seconds. So notice the deficit is far greater. They've had to borrow more of this non-oxidative energy, which, as we said, clinically is a real indicator of somebody's underlying fitness, but athletically in sport, we understand that relevancy in terms of if I've had to borrow that energy, at some point I've got to pay that back. It's either going to cost me because I'm going to be fatigued from borrowing it, or if I've got less energy, well, I've got a problem perhaps when I need to accelerate or need to generate more force, or if I need to try and recoup that, I need to resynthesize it, I'm going to have to reduce my exercise intensity quite significantly. And I thought this would be worth showing. So this is some data which fundamentally just shows for us and these are simulated, but they're quite neat, the changes in PCR and VO2 across 2 exercise bouts. So what you have here is the solid line is the VO2 response. So you've got here at baseline, VO2 rises, it reaches steady state. At the same time, the PCR concentration declines and it reaches its steady state. It's not that it's run out, it's just reached its steady state because we've reached a steady state in the VO2 response. In other words, the amount of oxygen coming in is matching the oxygen demand of the tissue, which is matched in turn to the ATP turnover rate. We terminate exercise, so the VO2 response drops. We go into what's called a recovery period here. Because we're now using less oxygen, and oxygen is not being used to engage the muscle, that oxygen is now helping to resynthesize the PCR concentration. And this is over a time period here. It's about, what's this? Is about an 8-minute time period. So we pretty much get full resynthesis in that 8-minute period, particularly if it was active-based exercise. Same thing again, we now go for the onset of exercise, VO2 rises to meet the ATP demand in the tissue, PCR concentration declines. So it's a really nice just representation of what we've been referring to. And this is really important to understand that what we've probably got here is they are pretty low intensity exercises, and as we've got the recovery of the PCR. Had that recovery of the PCR not been made possible for various reasons, and we didn't do an active recovery, the recovery was too intense, the recovery is too short, the VO2 response would still follow the same pattern, but because there's less PCR, the VO2 kinetics would take so much longer because you'd have to rely less on PCR because you've not resynthesized it and more on intramuscular glycogen to be used glycolytically. Now, what we've got here is changes in muscle blood flow. And this is quite a useful thing to kind of understand, because what you can see is the responses in two different conditions. Now, we're going to come to the conditions in a moment, and these refer to as heavy intensity and moderate. So moderate is exercise which is below the lactate turn point or the gas exchange threshold, and heavy is exercise which is between the lactate turn point or gas exchange threshold and maximal lactate steady state or respiratory compensation point. But what you can see here, particularly if you look at muscle oxygen uptake, notice the pattern. That pattern is almost identical, is it not, to what we see in terms of being measured at the mouth. Which isn't surprising, because you're trying to take air in from the atmosphere to meet the demand for oxygen at the tissue. So it's not surprising that you get this monophasic, depends how you model it, to triphasic response in terms of the VO2 uptake or the oxygen uptake at the tissue. Linked with that then is this, which is the thigh blood flow. You've obviously have to oxygenate the thigh in this case. You have to provide oxygen to meet that demand. At the same time, what you have here is the AVO2 difference. That the AVO2 difference is really high at the onset of exercise. In other words, we're having to extract a large amount of oxygen at the tissue from the oxygen that's at the tissue at that point. And that's simply because you're not delivering oxygen centrally instantaneously. Remember that you have to increase the delivery through the cardiorespiratory system. That takes time, and we've already seen that it takes maybe 2 to 4 minutes to reach a steady state. But as the oxygen becomes available more readily, that is, it's delivered more readily, the amount that we have to extract at the tissue, the AVO2 difference declines. It's not that we stop extracting, it's that we're fundamentally getting to the point where the amount that we're extracting is proportional to the amount of oxygen we need to meet the demand at the tissue. And we see that for both this kind of moderate intensity and heavy intensity exercise. And what we've got here is a little bit more. So we've got some data for cardiac output, Q, stroke volume, and then heart rate. It's in 4 subjects. And what they've got is from rest, they're just doing low intensity exercise. So the dashed lines are arm exercise and the solid lines are leg exercise. Now, irrespective of whether we're doing arm or leg, what I want you to focus on is the kinetics. Remember that in previous sessions we've learned that VO2 and VO2 and Q are matched. So VO2 is Q times AVO2 difference. They have this very, very, inextricable link. So actually the kinetics of cardiac output, irrespective of whether it's arm or leg exercise, follow the same kinetic you would see for the VO2 response, as does the heart rate response. The one that's perhaps a bit more raggedy is the stroke volume response. And the reason there's a bit more noise because it's kind of that representation of the ejection of the blood per beat of the heart. But it's really important to understand that there is a kinetic response in almost all of the systems. And that VO2 response that you're measuring at the mouth is a reflection of these underlying responses. And it was just worth showing this because you can see that even if we're doing arm and leg exercise, the cardiac output is fairly similar between the two, but the stroke volume is not. Okay, now that's quite important. So the stroke volume, here's the dashed lines, this is for arm exercise. The stroke volume is much higher for the leg exercise. Why? Well, there's a greater muscle mass. But the way that we compensate for that in the arm exercise is there is a greater heart rate response for the arm exercise than there is for the leg exercise, but still following the same VO2 based response. So one of the things we